Hi everyone, Jason here from spiritualbabies.net, and you've joined us for chapter 2 of Joel, and guiding us through this book in the season of Minor Prophets, if you like, is Rabbi Neely. Thank you very much for last week and for coming back and helping us again today.
Oh, my pleasure.
The chapter 1 we went through, and it was a series really of warnings to do with a famine and a blight in the lands. I think maybe 2 will give us a bit more perspective about the story, because it was a little bit, I think the warnings were severe, but the if this was a novel, the story arc would have been weak. But
because it seemed to be a premonition, might be the right word. Remember, there was a big focus on the invasion of locusts that were also coming, and it seems like that was all a dire warning and an attempt to divert the people from the path they were going down. So chapter 2 is going to pick up, and the commentators argue about whether chapter 2 picks up with the famine now underway and the locusts coming, or whether chapter 2 is still one last ditch effort to avoid. So it's either chapter 2 is happening with things happening, that is to say, with the bad stuff already occurring, and it's trying to mitigate it from being even worse, or it's the last ditch effort to prevent it from beginning.
Blow a horn in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mount. Let all dwellers on earth tremble, for the day of the Lord has come. It is close. The day of the Lord as a phrase, it seems that there are several days of the Lord, and that it's never a good thing.
Well, that's not entirely true. All right, so Yom Adonai, yes, is definitely used in many prophetic texts to mean the day when the jig is up, right? Or the gig is up, excuse me, where the bill comes due. God is no longer going to let us push it down the road, and the consequences are finally going to be revealed of everything that we've been doing and everything we've been warned about for however many years prior to it. And yeah, that normally does feel bad if you're the person who's now facing those consequences. On the other hand, would we really want to live in a world where God didn't care about the world? Conversely, however, we also get the phrase, Bayom Hahu, on that day, as a repeated refrain for the coming of the Messianic era. So just the fact that it's a day that God has appointed doesn't make it a bad day. It just means this is the fulfillment. The difficulty is that the majority of the prophecies that are found within the prophetic works were designed to turn us away from our bad behavior. And so the days that were being predicted were generally days of punishment and fallout from our behavior. And that can skew our feeling towards what kind of days God has in store. But that really is down to our choice more than God's.
It's interesting to me that it says all dwellers on the earth tremble, as opposed to just the people that the declaration was intended for.
So, yeah, about that phrase. So, Kol Yoshvei Haaretz is the Hebrew phrase that's used there. All that dwell, and then Haaretz is a lovely word, because it can mean land in the sense of a particular geographical region, all the way out to including a whole country, and all the way out to including the entire planet. So sometimes it is open to multiple interpretations of whether or not we are talking about the land, meaning a particular country, often Israel, or whether we're talking about the world, the entire world. And Kol Yoshvei Haaretz is often used in later rabbinic writings and even now in prayer, where we're talking about the entire world inhabitants. But that doesn't mean that Yoel was necessarily pointing to all of the world's inhabitants.
Right, because when you talk about Israel today, it goes by the same title. It must cause problems when you're looking at something like the flood story.
It doesn't cause problems. It causes opportunities for interpretation.
Okay, that's better. I like that. I'm not here to cause a problem. I'm here to...
Well, another place where you'll get people arguing and sometimes their own theology in a bunch is when it talks about, for example, the famine during the time of Joseph.
Right.
And it says there was a famine across the entire land and there was no food in the land. But does that mean there was no food in South America?
Mm.
Right? Because when we says haaretz, is that talking about the entire world? Or is it talking about the entire world that was relevant to Jacob's family?
Mm.
And that regional area would have been experiencing a famine. Because certainly we know it's more than one country, because there was a famine in Egypt and there was a famine in Canaan.
Mm.
But the question is, how much further did it extend? It's ambiguous. And personally, I'm of the opinion that the text only told us what we needed for the story, and it wasn't making claims about what was going on in Alaska. It was just telling us that as far as Jacob's family was concerned, there was a famine everywhere that mattered to them.
Mm. Okay. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of densest cloud, spread like soot over the hills. A vast, enormous horde, nothing like it had ever happened, and it shall never happen again through the years and the ages. So, I mean, in the next line, I can read the word, the vanguard is a consuming fire. The cloud is like soot. I assume then that could be a number of things, couldn't it? I mean, it could be the dust that's picked up by horses and men. It could be, I mean, I've seen pictures in National Geographic of swarms of locusts and other insects that can block out the sun. Do we get an inkling here?
Well, that is the general translation for this. I mean,
Right.
The general interpretation is that this is talking about the locusts, and the idea that they're going to come like a tangible cloud. You know, we've all seen clouds. They're huge, they're enormous, they're wonderful. This is going to be one that smacks you in the face.
Mm.
And as it comes, it's just going to be unprecedented. We talked a little bit last time about how there might be 4 different stages to their attack, or 4 different types of locusts that come. But this is definitely going to be an unprecedented infestation that will leave the entire world, See, there I go doing it. Leave the entire land shattered in its wake.
Okay, and it says that this is going to be a one-off thing, like Noah's flood. Although, I mean, nothing like it has ever happened, and it shall never happen again through the years and the ages. I mean, one could argue, is that just talking about the people it's directed to today? Or could it happen to a different group in a different land? I don't know if it's how important it is. But in any case, this is a one-off event. Right. Their vanguard is a consuming fire, their rear guard a devouring flame. Before them, the land was like the Garden of Eden. Behind them, a desolate waste. Nothing has escaped them. That speaks for itself. But it's interesting that they're using the Garden of Eden as a reference. We sometimes forget, well, I forget anyway, that the texts of the Bible were being used by the people in the Bible.
Yes, it wasn't published all at once.
Mm.
The people who came later on in the history had access to the earlier texts.
Mm. They have the appearance of horses. They gallop just like steeds.
But again, yes, this section and the next is really just trying to describe this coming of the locust. It's not going to be just a little where they fly in. This is going to be this enormous army of locusts that come smashing in as though you were being driven down by the thunder of hooves.
With a clatter of chariots, they bound on the hills with a noise like blazing fire consuming straw. Like an enormous horde arrayed for battle. People tremble before them. That's interesting because in the last chapter we looked at, that we spoke a little about how the locust could be an army of people. And here we've got the language being used that these are locusts, but like an army of people, chariots, horses, array for battle. So is it kind of sorry not sorry situation where they're talking about an army of people, but they don't want people to know it's an army of people, but they're dropping hints to let them know that really it's an army of people?
Well, certainly Abarbanel is one of the strongest commentators to interpret this as being the different four different stages of invasion of the land of Israel, and he takes all of this as being less simile and more description.
Right.
Right. They are arrayed like a battle. They are chariots coming over the mountaintops. But it's really not clear. I mean, it could go either way. That's why our classic commentators are divided on whether this is describing a human invasion or the insect invasion.
Right.
And even the sound effects work for both. I don't know if you've ever been near a largish fire, but the crackling noise, I think, is probably a really good description for what the crackling noise of thousands and thousands of bugs eating would sound like. And that would probably be rather terrifying, and I'm pretty sure I would tremble before that as well.
Given the choice, I'd never be near a burning house in the field full of insects. I just don't. I'm not going to... Okay. Enough about my phobias with insects. Peoples tremble before them, all faces turn ashen. They rush like warriors. They scale a wall like fighters, and each keep to his own track. Their paths never cross. No one jostles another. Each keeps to his own course. They should fall through a loophole. They do not get... And should they fall through a loophole, they do not get hurt. They rush up the wall, they dash about in the city, they climb into houses, they enter like thieves by way of the windows. Well, there's, it's very descriptive. I mean, it's gone from over the hill, into the fields, into the cities, and then through the holes in the windows of their homes, into these people's rooms. Can't just lock your door and hope it will go away. They're going to get right into your kitchen.
It is just absolutely an inundation, almost like water seeking out every crack. One translation option that I just find interesting is the phrase they have loophole there. It's a little bit unclear from the Hebrew which way it should be translated, but another different translation I saw describes it as being that if they fall upon the sword or a weapon, they will not be hurt.
Oh, okay.
The idea being that if someone were standing in the midst of a swarm and they were to swing their sword around, it would do almost nothing to the swarm.
All right. Before them earth trembles, heaven shakes, sun and moon are darkened, and stars withdraw their brightness. Okay, I see some capital letters here, so it's going to get better. And the Lord roars aloud at the head of his army. For vast indeed is his host, numberless are those that do his bidding. For great is the day of the Lord. Most tremble. Who can endure it? So the army we're talking about here are these locusts.
That seems to be the plainest translation.
Yet even now, says the Lord, turn back to me with all your hearts, and with fasting and weeping and lamenting. That's generally, I mean, if you're going to pick one line and ask what the point of the prophets is, it's that line. Whenever anything gets bad, yet even now, turn back to me with all your hearts and with fasting, weeping, and lamenting.
And not surprisingly, that does turn out to be the almost the center of the chapter.
Oh, that's right in the middle of the text. I love the way that works.
Well, it's a different way of putting together your thesis statement than we're used to being taught in American schools, but it's a very powerful biblical technique that's used.
Okay. Rend your hearts rather than your garments, and turn back to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in kindness, and renouncing punishment. Now, I seem to remember, and I don't know if it's from this book, but the slow to anger is...
Sounds familiar?
Yeah.
Yes. So slow to anger, well, actually, the whole beginning of this, right? Chanun v'rachum, erech apayim v'rav chesed, that whole section is taken from Parashat Ki Tisa, when God makes his presence pass before Moses when he is in the cleft of the rock, and we get the attributes of God's mercy. And this is a phrase that we continue to chant on holidays as part of our liturgy. The longer phrase that's taken from the Torah portion. So again, not surprising, Yoel is paraphrasing with some direct quotation that interpretation of what God tried to make known to us all the way back then, which is that God is not trying to be angry. God is not trying to be punishing. God is trying to help turn us around. It's really nice, though, that 12 and 13 come as they do, because fasting, weeping, lamenting, it sounds very much like the physical act is what's important there.
Right.
And then 13 comes along and says, but it's not just about, tearing your garments and the show of mourning. It is about what you actually feel inside. And that is supposed to be reciprocal, right? We do the outside displays of mourning in order to encourage the inner display of mourning, and from the inner display of mourning, we are driven to do the outside display of mourning as well. It's meant to be a sort of feedback loop.
It's kind of one of the arguments that sometimes come up against when people talk about the sacrifices, and they say, well, especially if you're talking to a Christian, they'll say that Jesus was a sacrifice, and they'll say, well, God accepted sacrifices in the desert. Why is it different now? And the argument would be that a sacrifice is an external example of an internal difference. And it's the same here. It's saying rather than just do the external, you have to do the internal.
And that's made explicit in multiple places throughout the other prophets, as well as through Psalms, that God is not looking for sacrifices in and of themselves. And in fact, a sacrifice without the proper internal direction is an abomination.
14. Who knows, but he may turn and relent. Now, okay, we are told that God doesn't change his mind, that God is God, and but here it seems to say, who knows, but he may change his mind.
So it's not actually talking about changing his mind. It's talking about God will not have reached the point, and our behavior will not have reached the point where the full measure of punishment that's been described has become inevitable.
Okay.
Right? So it's not that God is going to say, you know what, that was a really nice lament you just gave. All right, fine, I won't do it. But it may be that we have not passed the point of no return yet, and therefore our return will be able to prevent the further punishment. Because that's the great psychological, theological tension that the people face. The prophets in particular, but also the nation, which is, how do you encourage people to return while not giving them confidence that they can continue transgressing without fear of punishment? Because as soon as you say, the punishment is happening, I'm sick and tired of it, then you've taken away the incentive to return. But on the other hand, when you say, it's okay, you have more time, you could still return, then you've also taken away the urgency of the return. So how do you balance that? And that's what verse 14 is trying to say, which is, look, it's happening, but we might not be too late. Maybe. But we won't know until we try. So better to return now and maybe be able to blunt what's either happening or about to happen. Again, this is why some commentators say that this is in the midst of the disaster rather than in the midst of the disaster rather than prior to it. But it really is just trying to capture that tension of how do you encourage people to return without making them either complacent or despairing of their potential.
So the rest of it, I'll read the whole of 14. Who knows, but he may turn and relent and leave a blessing behind for meal offering and drink offering to the Lord your God. But we are in the position now in the story that's kind of if this is mid-famine, it's going to be a little difficult to leave a meal offering and a drink offering.
So there are famines and there are famines.
Right. Okay.
Whenever there says there's a famine or it says there's a drought, people immediately conjure up imagery of nothing, like absolute no food anywhere or no water anywhere. The problem with that image is if there's no water anywhere, then 3 days later, everyone's dead.
Right. Yes, fair.
And it's just done. I mean, it's over, game over, we're all gone. And the same thing for food, a bit longer. If there really is no food, then we all starve and we're dead, right? And that kind of famine rarely happens. Sorry.
It's okay. I think
turn off that ringer.
It's such a funny sound.
It's a platypus. So that kind of famine very rarely happens. Most of the time when there's a famine, or a drought for that matter, it is a reduction in the amount of food such that the current population cannot eat enough to sustain their current population. And that means there are going to be deaths. And there are going to be some deaths, but not everyone is going to die. But it will be, more or there will be more deaths or fewer deaths depending upon how severe the famine is. So what's being described here is that if there is a abatement of the attack of the locusts, then there might be still enough food left for us to eat and a little bit left over that we could even offer a sacrifice to God.
I guess in that instance, what you're offering has more value if you've got less of it to give. Okay. 15. Blow a horn in Zion, solemnize a fast, proclaim an assembly. Gather the people, bid the congregation purify themselves. Bring together the old, gather the babes and the sucklings at the breast. Let the bridegroom come out of his chamber, and their bride from her canopied couch. So, I mean, we're looking at both ends of the spectrum as far as your life cycle is concerned, as well as people that might feel they have more important things to do.
Well, not just more important things to do, but, the symbol of the bride and groom in particular has always been considered to be the symbol of the people who were most involved in rejoicing amongst themselves.
Right.
And who, generally speaking, we do not trouble for any purpose, right? If the bride and groom are doing something and we need help with some other mitzvah, we let them continue their celebration rather than bother them. It's very, very rare. There's only a select few situations where we drag them out, if you will, from enjoying being together as they've just been, newlyweds. So there's this verse 16 has so much going on in it. So gather the people, have everybody purified. That seems very straightforward, right? Bring together the old, that's fine. But the babes and the suckling at the breast, well, if we're talking about tshuva here, if we're talking about repentance, what have they done that's wrong? Right? Well, why are we bringing them together with the people who are actually guilty? You don't bring babies to the trial to plead for mercy from the judge because the baby doesn't need mercy. The baby is innocent. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just I completely read over that and it didn't ring a bell. I'm annoyed at myself. Okay.
Oh. So did I until I read the commentaries. That's why no one ever studies it by themselves. You always need to use some commentary and guide whenever studying, because A, we may misinterpret, but B, more likely we'll just simply not notice that there's something that needs attention. It's just easy to slip past. Especially in a phrase like this where it just sounds like, as you said, young and old. We're used to having that phrasing, and so it doesn't strike us as unusual, except when we realize the purpose. So commentators argue that the bringing together of the babies, the children, is there to elicit the proper response from the parents and the rest of the community. That when you see the children suffering, when you see the children who are hungry and who are dying from the famine, you will be moved with sympathy for them to repent of your own deeds, to hopefully abate the situation. So it's the idea of saying, do you realize what you're damaging? Do you realize that even these children who are innocent are suffering because of your transgressions that have brought upon this horrible famine? Have you no shame? Have you no mercy for them? Even if you're in your own arrogant bubble thinking that you've done nothing wrong, can't you at least see that they are also suffering? Now, the bride and bridegroom, interestingly, the the tradition interprets that a couple different ways. One is the sort of what we call pshat, the simple, most straightforward way, which is basically saying that, yes, we bring even the bride and groom out from their chamber in order to have them be part of this communal sense of remorse. But there's another interpretation in the Mishnah and also in the Talmud that talks about the bride and groom. The groom is actually the ark of the covenant, and that it would be brought out into the community space when there was a fast being pronounced for the nation. And they also said that the nasi, the leader of the community, would come out as well, and that was considered to be the bride.
Wow. Okay.
Again, commentary. It's
right.
It's good for you.
Between the portico and the altar, let the priests, the Lord's ministers, weep and say, "Oh, spare your people, Lord. Let not your possession become a mockery, to be taunted by nations. Let not the people say, 'Where is their God?'" That reminds me a little bit of Moses speaking to God.
Mm-hmm.
Then the Lord was roused on behalf of his land and had compassion upon his people. Now, there seems to have been a change in the tense, because we're talking about, it's do, will do, and then we've got then the Lord was roused on behalf.
So, yeah, translation.
Right.
Right, so the phrase that's used could be used as a past tense phrase. There's a tense where you have the vav at the beginning of a future tense word, and that makes it feel like a past tense action. And that happens very, very often. On the other hand, maybe this is not meant to be that. Maybe this is trying to be more a sequential, right? And then God will, ... And that's where interpretation comes in. But one thing I want to point out is that the phrase "roused" here is one that usually gets translated as to be jealous.
Oh.
And people always say God is a jealous God and all of that, which of course in modern English sounds totally stupid, because jealous doesn't mean stop hanging around my wife kind of jealous. Jealous means to be passionate, to be an ardent defender of something. And that really is kind of what's being described here, is that God will become more prominently, or will act in a more prominent way in defense of the people, of the land. And that is going to turn aside the worst of what was looking like going to happen from all of this attack.
Okay. In response to his people, the Lord declared, "I will grant you the new grain, the new wine, and the new oil." All these things were at the beginning of the book, at risk. "And you shall have them in abundance. Nevermore will I let you be a mockery among the nations. I will drive the northerner far from you." All right. In England, that means something completely different. I suppose it works in America too, but in England, you're either a northerner or a southerner. I would definitely be a southerner. "I will drive the northerner far from you. I will thrust it into a parched and desolate land, its van to the eastern sea and its rear to the western sea. And the stench of it shall go up, and the foul smell rise. For the Lord," that's in brackets, the Lord, "for the Lord shall work great deeds." So again, this seems to be in a kind of a contemporary state to the story. I guess, you could put brackets around it. Because when I look at the text, sometimes I see kind of computer code or kind of a flow chart.
Right.
So I see that God says you have to do this, this, and this, and this, and then if you do, then we have this little bit here. And that's why it's in present tense, and it says what it says, and it seems to be in present tense. And if you don't, it's kind of, you go back to the beginning again.
Right. If not, rerun.
Right.
But the idea here again, we can translate verse 20 to be either talking about the locust horde
mm,
as being the northerner, and the idea that it's going to be blown out into the wilderness, and that it will be blown out into the sea, and that it will just fall and die, and the stink of all of the dead bugs will be around, but overall will survive. It won't just be that it disappears; you'll see it fall. Or on the other hand, this could be the interpretation of the invading army. Massive as it is, will be stricken and fall, and it's going to be nasty, but you'll recognize that that was by God's hands, not by our own.
has it ever been put? I mean, are we talking to the people in the Southern Kingdom in this particular book?
So I think we discussed a little bit last
Mm.
time, it's unclear both when and where Yoel was prophesying, of whether he was speaking primarily to the southern, to the northern, or even to the still unified
Mm.
tribes of Israel, if he was indeed one of Samuel's children. So your interpretation of this can vary depending upon how you interpret when he was.
Mm. Okay. Fear not, O soil, rejoice and be glad, for the Lord has wrought great deeds. O soil. Oh, okay. So we're kind of harkening back to the latter part of chapter 1. If I scroll back up there. So the Lord, it says how the beasts are going to groan and the seals will be shriveled under their clods. But now we are kind of looking at the soil being able to rejoice because it's gonna because God's gonna let it really do what its job is. Fear not, O beasts of the field, for the pastures in the wilderness are clothed with grass, and the trees have borne their fruit. Fig tree and vine have yielded their strength.
All right, so land and beast are both bouncing back from all of this. And of course, the land bounces back first, so then the beasts have a place to eat, and that works very well agriculturally. Now, there is another interpretation which I found rather interesting, which again, if you're reading all of this as being the military invasions, the successive invasions of Israel, then Abarbanel reads all of this as being messianic and saying the beasts of the field, and hope no one takes this the wrong way, is referring to the non-Jewish nations of the world.
Ooh.
And that they too should recognize that when the Messiah comes, it is to bring peace and good for everyone around the world. Right?
Okay.
They have been caught up as well. I mean, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Romans, they didn't only attack us; they attacked nations around the world, and therefore, when they fell, people should also recognize that that's good for the other nations.
Okay, very good. Right. O children of Zion, be glad, rejoice in the Lord your God, for he has given you the early rain in his kindness. And now he makes the rain fall as formerly, the early rain and the late. Now there's got to be a whole ton of stuff. Whenever rain is mentioned, especially when it talks about early and late rain, even in my shallow dips, the rain's always mentioned a lot in the commentaries.
No, of course. I mean, first of all, I mean, we can read this. We don't have to go too into the commentary. We can read this in the straight notion that the rain is always very, very critical in Israel. Right? The distinction is made between Israel and Egypt. That is, Egypt is watered by our own efforts, and Israel is not. Israel is watered by the sky. And there were two main rainfalls, the early and late rains, that if they came either too early or too late, would ruin the harvest. And this is basically saying they are going to come at the right time. What this is also trying to say is that perhaps there may be even some sort of makeup, that if the rain didn't come when we thought it was going to come because of the drought, famine, and destruction, that perhaps there will be some form of makeup rain that will help us overcome the destruction that has happened.
The threshing floor shall be piled with grain, and vats shall overflow with new wine and old. So like the rain we just spoke about, it's not just going to be getting things running again, but there seems to be, it will be overflowing, it'll be extra.
Well, yes, but it's something to remember is that extra was supposed to be the normal. That is to say, the land of Israel was always supposed to be able to produce in abundance. It wasn't
Right.
just a
Okay.
mediocre place to be. It was some place where if the weather and life was normal, you should always have a surplus. And unfortunately, that didn't always happen. And so we got used to having deprivation and want and famine and droughts and shortages and all those things. But when it returns just to normal, it will be abundant.
I will repay you for the years consumed by swarms and hoppers, by grubs and locusts, and the great army I let loose against you. And you shall eat your fill and praise the name of the Lord your God, who dealt so wondrously with you. My people shall be shamed no more. And you shall know that I am in the midst of Israel, that I, the Lord, am your God, and there is no other, and my people shall be shamed no more. It's in the midst of Israel. The only other point so far that I can call to mind is it's in the Torah, and it's the part about, excuse me, but doing your business outside the camp. And it says, because God is in the midst of Israel, and you don't really kind of ever get that connotation. Normally he's above it, like he's looking down on some diorama. But it's great that there's these phrases that kind of remind you that it's like he's there within the people, within the town, within the village, within the shepherd's flock, within the temple. So there's a presence everywhere. It's not just some overseeing eye.
Yes, and also, hearkening back to that same wilderness experience, we were also told there that we would eat and we would be satisfied, and then we would bless God. And that seems, again, to be what's being remarked of here on verse 26. You will eat, you will be satisfied, is literally what the text says. I think the translation you read was like, eat your fill.
Right, yeah, and praise, yeah.
Right, and then it uses the term praise rather than bless. That's the only distinction that would have with the verse from the Torah, and the idea that yes, everything will be gone, and it will be because again we recognize that God is our God, and that was the whole point of bringing us out of Egypt, of leading us through the land of Israel, of everything that's happened. So yeah, how about if we actually just remember that from time to time?
I'm curious now because we're at the end of chapter 2, but it feels like that would have been a good natural end to that story. So I'm kind of curious now as to what is going to happen next. But we'll have to wait until the next time we record.
Right. I should also point out that this is a section of the Haftarah for Shabbat Shuvah. That is the Shabbat that we have between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur.
Okay. Is there anything else that we've missed?
I think we've done pretty well for a quick survey of Chapter 2.
Brilliant. All right, thank you very much, Rabbi, for joining us again. I really appreciate your time.
I always enjoy it.
And you guys at home, make sure that you click on the little question mark at the top of the screen. That will take you over to Rabbi Neely's YouTube channel. You can find a ton of stuff over there. If you like this, you'll like that even more because it's more of him and less of me. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And we'll see you all again very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.